This discussion will be 60 minutes. We would like to have a fireside chat between Dr. Ho and myself, and then we will intersperse questions. And there are two ways for you to ask questions as we go. Please, first of all, try to keep the questions short so that we can try to get to most of them. And you can go to the bottom of your screen if you're in the Zoom app where there is a chat space, and you can put your question there. And again, I will try to get to most of those that are put in there. Again, it's at the bottom of your Zoom app. We've got a lot of topics. First of all, Dr. Ho, thanks for being here with us.
Thank you, Richard, and thank the committee for the opportunity to have this fireside chat.
It is great. And Dr. Ho has been a longtime member of the Committee of 100. And so thank you for your commitment to the group as well and the topics that need to be discussed from the community's perspective. For those of you who are fanboys or fangirls of Dr. Ho, I am one of those. Let me just give you a little bit of his background in terms of why we're fanboys or fangirls of Dr. Ho. Dr. Ho has a long career as a leading researcher here in the United States. He's a Caltech trustee, bachelor's in 1974, is that right? A couple days ago, and now leading the Irene Diamond AIDS Research Center, or excuse me, you're a trustee of the Irene Diamond AIDS Research Center at Columbia University. And you have also led back in the 1980s AIDS research there in the epicenter in Los Angeles. After that, we will remember during the Sars scourge, you were also advising many polities across the country, Asia notwithstanding. And now, as you are working to find a treatment for COVID-19, you are also based, I understand, here at Columbia in New York City as well. So you've seen your share of epicenters when it comes to diseases, viruses that have grown, and in this case, to a pandemic. Is that broadly correct in terms of the way I could describe you, Dr. Ho?
Yes, you summarized it nicely, Richard. Thank you.
All right, Doc. You betcha, you betcha. I'm looking forward to this conversation. First off, what is COVID-19?
Well, COVID-19 is a coronavirus. It's what we call an RNA virus. It's actually quite small. It's smaller than HIV, but about 3 times the genome size of HIV. And therefore a bit more complicated. And it's highly related to the Sars coronavirus by about 80% or so.
Really?
But it's even more closely closely related to a virus found in bats in China, about 97% identity.
Talk about, you said the size of the genome is quite large. Does that mean for us lay people that you have more pieces to investigate, more pieces to identify?
Yes, there are a number of genes we could just tell by the sequence that they encode for some structural proteins of the virus, say the core of the virus or the surface protein of the virus or various enzymes. But there are additional genes that are involved in more complex function, which would need to be elucidated.
If you were to draw an analogy for what we might, let's say if you were to be a chef and the number of ingredients trying to break down what it makes that thing, how would you analogize that for us to make it simpler for us to understand?
Well, I think, you know, for HIV, every component we know and have studied for 30 some years. So we know it extremely well. For coronaviruses, I would say there are half a dozen or more components we know extremely well, but some components that are still somewhat a mystery to us. And so, you know, we need to understand it fully in order to combat this enemy.
So this is very interesting. Dr. Ho, as you go back in your research history and you remember AIDS, HIV AIDS, and the arc that you went through in your research, And now and then SARS thereafter, and that arc in your research and trying to find out, you know, how to scope the problem and then scope a treatment, right? How does this compare to those two arcs?
Well, HIV is a chronic disease. It surfaced in 1981, and since then, it's infected about 75 million people worldwide, approximately half of whom have died. But it's a very chronic, slow-moving disease. And by the time we first recognized HIV in 1981, the virus actually had already spread quite extensively. SARS is very much like the COVID-19. It's an acute infection, respiratory problems causing pneumonia, and it also originated in China. But that was brought under control with a total infection number about 8,000 with 800 deaths. But of course, what we're seeing now with COVID-19 is a pandemic that is easily going to be 50 or 100 times bigger than SARS. SARS was wiped out. It's not clear that we're going to wipe this one out. And we could talk about that further, but it's also quite similar to HIV in the sense that by the time you see your first case in the community, it's probably spread extensively already. And that's certainly the case for New York City, where we sit today.
Doctor, do dig down into what you were saying in terms of it may have more lasting power, I guess is what you're saying, than other afflictions that you've had to combat before. Address that point that you were just bringing up. Also, number two, in terms of the spread of COVID-19, is it 4 times the rate of the common flu? Give us that sort of space as well, that number.
Yeah, I think initially when COVID was spreading through Wuhan and Hubei province in China, the so-called rate of spreading, or the reproductive ratio, or some people call it R0, was estimated to be somewhere between 2 and 4. That if one infected person could infect 2 to 4 individuals. That's not all that different from SARS. And that's probably slightly higher than seasonal flu. But seasonal flu is not consistently the same year to year. And of course, these numbers are not a reflection of the virus itself. If you drop Ebola in rural Africa, the R0 will be quite small. If you drop Ebola in the middle of Manhattan, the R0 will be very huge. So R0 is not a reflection of just the virus, but a reflection of population density, transport, and behavior. And this one, the R0 is said to be approximately the same, but the problem is that unlike SARS and unlike seasonal flu, there are a lot of people who are infected and have no symptoms or mild symptoms, and they go about their daily activities and spreading the virus. And that's really tough to control, because with SARS, you just measure fever, and if there's no fever, there's no transmission. This is not the case, and that's why we're seeing a pandemic of this magnitude, approaching 500,000 cases worldwide already.
Why is COVID-19 like that? How did it get to be that way?
Well, that we don't know. We do know that early on in the illness, if there is an illness, there's already a fair amount of the virus in the mouth and in the nose of the infected person. SARS was different in that it started low and increased as the illness progressed. And so there's this period of asymptomatic transmission for COVID-19. And also we now know, based on studies from China, that infected persons will continue to shed this virus even after they recover, perhaps for 2 to 3 weeks. And so transmission is still possible in convalescent patients.
2 to 3 weeks, yet we have a stay-at-home, more or less, suggestion order of 2 weeks.
Yes, yes, that's indeed the case. I guess we got to go with a number that's practical. What I said earlier was 2 to 3 weeks, we could still detect the virus in the mouth, let's say, but that doesn't mean it's in sufficient quantity to transmit. So the infectiousness potential is there, but whether it's actually infectious is not known.
How is this virus learning compared to the way others have learned and mutated?
Well, you know, viruses, they don't learn. They do it by evolution via large numbers. And so in general, RNA viruses, every time they replicate, there will be mistakes or mutations made. It also doesn't have a proofreading function like our DNA copying machinery does. And so it will make errors at a rate that's fairly predictable. And any mutation, while most mutations are disadvantageous, some may confer some advantage, and that's evolutionary pressure, and that will emerge, whether that's related to drug resistance or to virulence or to better replication in humans. That's how viruses adapt.
And this one specifically, how is it mutating? Is it mutating at a faster or slower rate than others?
It's mutating at rates that are similar to RNA viruses.
Okay.
In contrast to influenza, COVID-19 will not rearrange, so it doesn't change as quickly as influenza does.
It does not. And why does it not?
Because its genome is not segmented, which allows it to shuffle. For flu, the genome is segmented, so it could shuffle, two strains could combine and shuffle their genes. Coronaviruses cannot do that.
When we look at where we're at in the United States, what stands out to you? I'm going to pull up a curve right here, and these are the daily increases in confirmed cases in the United States. And I'm going to share that right now with folks so that we can see it. This right here, Dr. Ho, what are we seeing?
Yeah, if those are daily cases, we're basically, for the past week or so, experiencing exponential growth. And here in New York City or New York State, we're definitely seeing exponential growth. We're the new Wuhan. We already surpassed their numbers in terms of daily infections. In New York State, it peaked 2 days ago at 5,700 cases.
Right.
In New York City, 2 days ago was 3,260 cases.
And here's the New York numbers. Here are the New York numbers for you from Johns Hopkins.
Right. So those are huge. And
look at the curve here, Dr. Ho. That's what we're worried about, right?
Yes. So we're still in the upswing of the epidemic. If you line this up temporally with what was observed in Italy, it would be pretty much the same. So we're on the same trajectory as Italy. And we know that their death rate is high and has already surpassed that of China. I would just tell you here, sitting in New York,
right?
We are the epicenter of this epidemic in the world right now. Just in our Columbia network-wide, there are 800 patients in the hospital with COVID infection. The ICUs for each one of those hospitals is pretty much full. At Columbia Presbyterian alone, we have 200 some patients in the hospital. The ICU is full. Beds are full. Ventilators are in shortage. As you know, PPEs are lacking. We are reusing masks. We are out of swabs to do the testing, and it's tragic. And you know, just a couple of days ago, there were 2 women who delivered. They were COVID positive, and the obstetricians and the nurses were all exposed. And now we're down 2 OB teams. So the healthcare workers are really threatened. I would just tell you another thing. I've been watching. Our first case was only 3 weeks ago, but now we have the numbers that we just talked about, and the percentage of the swabs for testing for COVID-19. I saw it go from 10% at the beginning to 20 to 25 to 50, now 55, 60% of the swabs are positive. And I will also tell you that in our research studies, we've been testing blood samples from late February, and it's pretty clear there were cases that were missed. So that the virus was already quite widespread before the first case was identified on March 2nd here in New York City.
I'm going to get to all of those topics in the time we've got, because you've covered a lot of great stuff here, Doctor. One of the things I wanted to also look at was Italy, and why Italy potentially is a place for us to watch, to understand what might happen in the United States. And so when we look at the Italy confirmed cases and the United States, I wanted to, you brought up that 2-week time period. When we look at the Italy curve here of cases, going back to, I guess, the end of February might be what you would say would be the beginning of the cases, right? They're about a month into it right now, and they are still on that upward rise, on that hockey stick. Is this what we might see here in New York?
That's our fear. We obviously don't know. New York was a little behind California and Washington in terms of shutting things down. So I suspect that's why we're seeing such a sharp rise. Also, the density of the population is much greater here, favoring transmission. So our fear is that this will be will follow the trend of Italy, and we need to note that in Italy the death rate is approximately 10%, which is extremely high compared to other countries, and that is concerning because it's clear that when your healthcare system is overwhelmed, many of the sicker patients would die if the supportive care is not delivered. And that's what all the hospitals in New York are gearing up for, to make sure we're not overwhelmed that way. We are repurposing public spaces, including armories and convention centers and such, and trying to turn them into healthcare facilities.
Right. And we're going to get to more on that. On the screen now are the daily confirmed cases in Italy. And again, if we were to try to learn from what we're seeing in Italy, translate that into New York being the epicenter of the United States and globally, what are you learning from these numbers on the Italy daily increase of cases? Question is, have they hit the peak yet?
They may have. And if you look at their neighbors, Germany and France, it looks like those have at least plateaued. Instead of continuing to go up. And Italy, of course, implemented lockdown about some days or a week earlier than in the US. So it's pretty clear that a few countries are beginning to bend that curve, flatten that curve.
Here's China. Here's China right now, daily cases.
Right. Well, the large peak in the middle, you should ignore in that's just a change in definition. Right. But if you look, China or particularly Wuhan peaked around 4,000 cases per day. Right. New York State has passed that already. And China, of course, implemented complete lockdown of Hubei province, and really then began to flatten the curve to a point where there were in the whole country of 1.3 billion, no community transmission, only imported cases.
Got
And
it.
so that's pretty remarkable. And South Korea, if you look at their curve, pretty much bent it with a slower decline than China, but without implementing lockdown, just going with many of the mitigation measures that the US is now applying. And so the point is, there are multiple ways of getting to controlling the epidemics, flattening the curve, so-called.
Yeah.
But what we need to remember is that if you flatten the curve.
Here's South Korea, doctor. Here's South Korea.
Right. So that's done without lockdown or anything close to what China has done. And I guess the US model is going to be more similar to this pattern. So
okay,
it could be done, except we're a much larger country than South Korea. And South Korea was, this graph is largely a reflection of one particular region of South Korea. So it's much more manageable than the whole country of America with, 330 million people or so.
Right. For those of you just joining us, thanks for being here with the Committee of 100's Fireside Chat with Dr. Ho, Dr. David Ho, world-renowned researcher when it comes to diseases and issues that we're facing today with COVID-19. This Fireside Chat with Dr. Ho, as he and his team at Columbia University at the Irene Diamond AIDS Research Center are looking to find treatments. We're a third of our conversation in. If you have a question, go to the bottom of your Zoom app. You can hit chat, put a question in there. We've got a lot of great questions. I am going to try to get to many of them. One question I want to ask before I get to some of those questions: does this affect young or older people more than the other? That has been something that's been discussed, as you know. And second, is the virus seasonal? Is it a hot or cold climate thing?
Well, this virus, we think, is infecting everybody, but it doesn't seem to cause as much illness in children as we have seen with seasonal flu. And in China, if you look at their numbers, yes, kids could be infected, but it's striking that there's very little symptomatology in many of them. And of course, we've been hearing now for many weeks that COVID strikes the elderly pretty hard.
Yeah.
And those with underlying cardiopulmonary diseases or other chronic conditions. So most of the deaths are going to be accounted for by the elderly or those with underlying chronic diseases. But we must also bear in mind there's enough mortality seen in folks who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And we don't fully understand why a few individuals who are young are dying from it. There's no doubt some genetic component is at play, and that needs to be sorted out by the scientists.
What about the seasonality, where folks will say, oh, it'll come or go like every other flu does?
Well, I think that's the big question right now, and this relates to how long we need to continue our mitigation measures. Mm-hmm. It's pretty clear that Sars 18, 17 years ago appeared in the fall and spread and became very severe during the early winter months of 2003. But then by spring and late spring and early summer, it was essentially gone. So that was wiped out. And maybe a month ago, most of us were hoping that COVID-19 would follow suit. But given the magnitude of this pandemic now, with, as we said earlier, about 500,000 people already infected, and many of them continue to shed virus, and then the pandemic is still growing, and it still has yet to severely impact India, South America, and Africa. But we know it has taken root, a strong foothold, in fact, in places like Argentina, South Africa, Australia. So as the condition warms up for us in the Northern Hemisphere, it's going to cool for them. And we know most of these respiratory viruses don't survive in the environment as well when the temperature is higher and when there's UV light provided through sunshine. And so, so typically these respiratory viruses will calm down in the warmer months, but become more severe or accelerate in the winter months. And so now more and more people like myself are thinking there's a distinct possibility that this would then, as our condition improves, it would take foothold in the Southern Hemisphere and bounce back and forth between North and South. That's exactly the pattern we see with seasonal flu. And if that is the case, we have to flatten the curve for a long time.
Yeah.
So we're not wiping it out.
It's more than one curve, isn't it, Dr. Ho? You're really saying we have to flatten multiple curves over the course of a year over year.
Yes. Just look at China, which has done a fantastic job of bringing it down. But all its neighbors, in quotes, are sick. And therefore, if it tries to gain some semblance of normalcy, it's going to be in trouble because another outbreak will occur. So the flattening the curve serves two functions. One is to make sure there's no surge in cases that will overwhelm the healthcare system. But then it buys us time to come up with a solution. If we don't come up with a solution over a 10-year course, the flattening of the curve does nothing. It will only continue to smolder and spread. So flattening the curve is actually buying time so that science could deliver.
So doctor, then, if you heard the governor of New York today and yesterday, he's saying, hold on a second, the data I'm seeing as governor shows that we are not only accelerating faster than our models were before, but the acceleration is also showing that we will peak higher than we had estimated if we were not to flatten the curve. Is that what you're seeing too?
Yeah, I would, you know, I can't speak to all the specifics. I don't know what he's looking at, but I could tell you what we look at today in terms of patients coming to the hospital, particularly those that are overwhelming the ICUs. We're looking at transmission about 3 weeks ago. Okay, so that's the status. So what we see today is actually one should backtrack 3 weeks. If you had a positive so-called PCR test on your throat swab, that probably is a reflection of something like 7 or 10 days ago. So what we could see is constantly behind the actual happening. And things like that. And I mentioned earlier, by the time there was one case in New York City, I could tell you greater than 10% of the blood samples that are randomly picked from the emergency room already show antibodies to COVID-19. And that's scary.
That is scary.
That's why this is what we see is only tip of the iceberg, and that beneath the surface, how large is it? We don't actually know, but it's undoubtedly large.
Doctor, I've got about 40 more questions on my list, and I've got about 80 questions that have come in on the chat. So we're going to try to do this rapid fire, and I'm just going to read several questions for you. This is the first part, digging into the virus. The next part is we are going to try to dig into the things that we should do day to day personally. I think somebody has now tried to share a screen. I don't know who's doing that, but
yeah, can you stop sharing your screen?
That would be great. Whoever's sharing their screen, please stop. Jack, stop sharing your screen. I love you, Jack, but just don't do that right now. Here's one of the questions that first came in. Dr. Ho, 3 questions. This is from Paul Lee. Are the haplotypes that cause asymptomatic infection less virulent, thus resulting in no symptoms? That's number 1. Number two, do we know for sure that recovered patients have neutralizing antibody that confers immunity? Three, can we identify the neutralizing antibody from recovered patients and produce the same in vitro as a therapeutic? First thing, doctor, put that in a sentence for simple folks like myself. And then if you could answer in 30 seconds, that'd be great.
Yeah, it's basically saying if somebody's infected, do they develop an immune response, and is that immune response going to be protected? The answer is we think so, and to this limited number of cases we study, these infected individuals do mount what we call a neutralizing antibody response. That means the antibodies will neutralize the virus, and we are in the midst of fishing for those antibodies so we could clone them out and mass produce them and give them as a prophylactic or a therapeutic.
Great. Three questions, answer them as fast as you can. Alan is asking from San Jose, Dr. Ho, to anticipate the shelter in place or lockdown duration in US, how much could we use the Wuhan lockdown duration as reference? That's one question. Then there's Victor, who asks, how can we get the message overall that as we look at what is happening today with the economy, put that into perspective of keeping people safe? And then third, Michael asking, do we need to wear masks when we're outside? Will that help?
We're not going to get out of this by Easter. We are, in most places in the US, we're just on the upswing. So I see that it's going to take weeks and weeks and perhaps months to bring it down. In terms of wearing the mask, it's not going to be helpful to wear a mask when you're uninfected and you're riding a bicycle on the street. But so that's the scientific perspective. But the societal perspective is that if the entire society begins to wear masks, that will put the infected people in a position to wear masks without stigma. And actually that will help. So that's a dimension that I have not considered until more recently. And my colleagues who are working in China says that is a universal mask wearing will eliminate stigma for those who are infected, and therefore keep their secretions more limited. And so I am now leaning toward, assuming we have enough masks.
Assuming.
Then I'm leaning toward that. I'm missing one question in the middle there.
No, you got it all. You got it all, actually. You did. Because you talked about the timing. You talked about the issue of when we can get back to business, if you will, as well as the issue of masks. When we're thinking of the tests, because we're watching those test numbers, right, doctor? And we're over 400,000, I believe, according to the COVID tracking site. But we were told 8 days ago, 9 days ago, we're going to have almost 2 million tests out across the country. So when you're looking at the data of confirmed cases right now, are we really looking at potentially 2x or 3x? How do you understand, how do you translate what we're getting, understanding that we don't have all the test kits out there right now?
These are some of the dynamic figures that we have tried to deduce from the Wuhan epidemic, and also now what we've been seeing in Europe and more recently in the US. I think it's not just 2x or 4x, it's higher than that. And so
10x?
I think that would be a good ballpark figure to use. So if worldwide figure is about 500,000, you could guess actually it's probably 5 million.
Wow. It's been said that we could, and it's been estimated we could see as many as 90 million Americans that have COVID-19. Is that a reasonable number?
I think some of those figures assume we do nothing or do very little and let the exponential growth curve continue. But I think in most places, these harsh mitigation measures should be applied. In my view, the whole country should be doing it. In places like Texas, you shouldn't wait until you hit the explosive phase, growth phase, to implement them. You need to implement them long before. Something that most Americans don't know is the fact that outside of Hubei province, Wuhan city, or Daegu in South Korea, Asia has done a fantastic job of keeping the epidemic curve very, very flat. Even within China, of all the other provinces or major metropolitan areas, there's no place with over 1,400 cases. In Taiwan, in Singapore, in Japan, in Hong Kong, the curves are extremely flat. So those SARS experienced regions actually have been doing a fantastic job. The only place that exploded is Wuhan, Hubei. And we need to be able to apply the same measures to every region in the US.
So for those of you who are joining us and are still with us, thanks for being with us with the Committee of 100 Fireside Chat with Dr. David Ho of Columbia University, famed researcher over the decades since the 1980s with HIV AIDS, then with SARS, and certainly more in between. And now today, as we look at COVID-19, we've been able to talk about the virus in our first part. It really started to become quite meaty. So we stayed in that first section. We got to some questions right now. Now I'm going to move into, and we had some discussion on this already, Dr. Ho, about what we need to do individually. We talked about the 14 days staying at home, and you said that is what might be practical, but your suggestion is it may need to be more. When can people expect to get back to work? That's a very big question right now. You said Easter would be too early, potentially.
I think this is a question I've been asking. It's not a question that I could answer. It's a question that all of us need to answer together. It's clear we need to bend the curve. We need to bring it under control, but how, at what cost? And if we say we need to do this for 6 months, as some folks in China are saying, wow, we're going to have the Great Depression or even worse. And what is the cost of that? And important is to keep in mind that while the numbers are huge for COVID-19, the numbers are still relatively small compared to seasonal flu. And seasonal flu kills as well, although with about 10% of the death rate of COVID-19. So it's tenfold less. SARS is about 3 or 4-fold higher than COVID-19. And so, you know, these are the hard questions that we together need to answer. Are we going to, in the midst of controlling the epidemic, allow life to change forever, essentially?
Right.
I don't know the answer to that. Economists and many other experts would need to weigh in. But of course, as scientists, we could weigh in with the scientific facts.
Right, right. Collaborations and working together is where we're going to get to the end of this, right, Dr. Ho? Moving on to some other things personally, and then we're going to get into some of the treatments, the vaccines that you are working along with other researchers right now. We really want to look at that hope. But I want to stay on personal for a second. What's the symptom or symptoms? If I notice them, I should reach out to somebody through telehealth and say, I need to talk to you?
I think it's actually pretty much like flu in the sense that fever is extremely common, if not universal, if you're going to have symptoms. Now remember, there could be asymptomatic individuals who are infected. Many of the NBA players, for whatever reason, were infected, but they are largely asymptomatic. But if you're going to have symptoms, fever is the most common, and a dry cough.
Right cough.
Sore throat and runny nose are not that common. And these days, sniffles are good because that's not an indication of COVID infection. Now, for more severe cases, there could be gastrointestinal symptoms, and then most worrisome would be shortness of breath. That means there's likely to be pneumonia. And of course, that pneumonia could progress to total lung failure. And that's typically the cause of death for these patients.
Shortness of breath would therefore mean coughing associated with it as well?
No, just finding difficulty with breathing, especially with some exertion.
At what point should one go to the hospital? I was reading a first-person account in the New York Times yesterday of a wife and husband who had COVID-19 and a daughter, and what they were living through, trying to get over that hump of the fever and the discomfort, using an inhaler, and her debate, when do I take him to the hospital?
I think severe shortness of breath. If you just have fever and dry cough, you might as well stay home. They're not going to admit you to the hospital, especially given the patient surge right now. But if you have trouble breathing, you're short of breath, you might need oxygen, you need supportive care. Call in advance, tell your doctor that you have such symptoms, and they'll admit you safely following precautions.
Hey, this is one that is, there's all sorts of things are daily activities of daily living, right? That we are all now being affected. Those friends and family members that are expecting, and they have no choice of diverting what might be seen as unneeded hospital services, right? If they are pregnant, what should they do? For those who are in that situation, what would you suggest?
I'm sorry, what situation? Just
if you're expecting to have a child and you cannot avoid, right? You're pregnant. Quickly, what would you suggest? And I understand this might be more clinical, but what would you suggest?
I think when you need to deliver, you go in, and I think the OB units are taking all the precautions. They modified procedure. Only the pregnant woman is allowed. All the other family members are not allowed.
Yeah.
One could be criticized, but that's the safest protocol that's being implemented.
Yeah, and I went through the same experience myself, Dr. Ho. My father was in ICU 2 weeks ago for pneumonia, not related to COVID-19. But that's when they started the process of nobody can go in, not even family members. So for those who are caregiving for somebody else or trying to advocate for somebody who is sick, this is certainly a different time in that you can't see loved ones. It's certainly a cultural dynamic that I remember when I was covering SARS in Singapore. Families, once a father or mother or daughter, whatever, was diagnosed with SARS, they were shut off completely. And most of these who were afflicted, many of these who were afflicted, died. So it was effectively a final goodbye before you knew it was a final goodbye.
Yeah, what we're seeing in the ICU is a final goodbye through the window, and it's very sad.
The dynamic of what you were trying to stop, sir. Dr. Ho, let's move on to the third section, and then we'll get to some questions. You are one of the big brains to stop that dynamic of the final goodbyes, because you come up with treatments, you come up with vaccines and things that the rest of us regular people could only hope to help with. What are you doing right now, and when do you hope to get it done?
Okay, well, in terms of treatment, the field, all we could use are existing drugs. So it's called repurposing of available drugs. And it turns out there are a couple that are being tested. One is called remdesivir. It was made to treat Ebola, and it's being tried for the cases in the hospital. As of now, we don't know whether it helps or not, but there are studies in progress. It's not an easy drug, and it potentially could be toxic, but it's the best we got. There's a lot of talk by our president about chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine, but the evidence in support of that is very thin. And you could tell by Dr. Fauci's remarks that contradict the president's remark that it's not likely to be very helpful. But again, there are studies that are being tried. I think the real effort is to look for drugs that work against COVID-19. And that's part of what our research is pursuing. There are enzymes of COVID-19 that it needs to survive and to replicate. For example, there's an enzyme called protease. It needs to cut the COVID-19 proteins from big pieces to smaller one so that the particle could be assembled. If we gum up this chemical scissor, then the virus cannot reproduce itself. And so we're in the midst of screening thousands of chemicals for ones that may gum up the chemical scissor. And already in the field, there are a few hits, but it takes a while to optimize the hits, so modify the chemistry of the compound so that it will bind tighter and tighter to the protease and therefore be more and more potent. But then once you get to that point, you still have to advance it into development, into manufacturing, into safety testing, and that's going to take many months to a year to a year and a half, even up to 2 years. That process normally takes 5 to 10 years, and we're trying to contract all of that into a year or a year and a half. We are doing the same with another target called the polymerase, which is the enzyme it uses to replicate the RNA to make more of the genome. And
Doctor, I just want to get back to something you said that is a big number, but it's a small number. You're trying to reduce the process down to a year and a half. How do you compress that? How do you get that done?
You work as hard as you can. You just keep pushing, knowing that you're not being say 100% thorough with everything. Normally we are extremely meticulous because you cannot, if you're going to develop a product for patients, you have to check certain experiments 3-4 times. I don't think we have that luxury right now. We need to buy time, buy for 1 year or 2 years. It makes a huge difference. And then the manufacturing process, you could speed that up. But most importantly, the FDA has to cooperate. They cannot continue to operate as business as usual. In the name of protecting the public, if they cannot figure out that the risk-benefit ratio has changed considerably. And that's why, to a large extent, today we don't have a lot of testing we need. Right? We've been talking about testing on the swab. That's a PCR test. But today we have no antibody test. That's another tool in our toolkit that we need. And FDA needs to get those tests approved because it's going to allow us to, if we want to, we could test every person in the population and find out who's antibody positive, who's antibody negative. Those who are antibody positive are already infected, and some of them might be immune. They could be redeployed back to the workforce without endangering themselves. So, every element of the typical drug development process need to be contracted, especially the regulatory element, which takes sometimes years to get through.
You've answered Amy's question and a lot of others questions as they were really drilling down on those very details that you gave us. When we're looking at your team, Doctor, tell us something about your team, because they're the ones behind you, right? Helping to make this happen. Tell me about a conversation you had with one of your teammates that inspired you to work harder, other than, of course, you have always been inspirational and hardworking to get this stuff done. But talk about your team if you can for a moment.
My team consists of folks who are a lot younger than me. they're mostly graduate student, postdocs, and a few senior associates in their, say, 40s or 50s. They are, you know, they're hardcore scientists who are dedicated to the mission. And a number of them are Asian Americans or Chinese Americans. And we became very interested in this as soon as we heard about these mysterious pneumonia cases in Wuhan. And of course, once it blew up in China, our world changed. We've been dedicating ourselves since about mid-January, nonstop, every day. And I could tell you, many of my colleagues work till 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., basically each person putting in 2 shifts.
Wow.
This old guy is trying to keep up as well.
Oh, come on. You're leading.
I haven't had a day off, I don't know, since January. So
what could we get your team that would help them?
I think, fortunately, we have gotten a number of donations so that we don't need to worry about covering our laboratory expenses. And fortunately, the government, with our grants, even though we are shifted to COVID, most of my funding is for HIV, and the government is not making a case of it,
right?
Allowing us to rob Peter to pay Paul, basically, and we're doing as much as we can. I would just tell you that it's inspirational as I see the frontline healthcare workers risking their health to take care of the overwhelming situation in the clinic and the hospital. And then the scientists whose labs have been asked to shut down because of social distancing, they're saying, we don't work on COVID-19, but we have skills. And yesterday, we sent a lot of molecular constructs to Cold Spring Harbor, for example, for them to help produce proteins for our experiments or produce certain pseudoviruses for our experiments. So people are stepping up and chipping in, and that's extremely inspirational to me.
How much funding are you talking about? Is it a $10 million gap? Is it a $5 million gap that you are looking at right now?
You know, we from 4 or 5 individuals, we raised certain millions of dollars so that we could get started. But if we have a drug development process going forward, that's going to take 20, 25 million easily for each one.
Okay.
And if we get into an antibody, we haven't talked about, that antibody development is even more costly.
How much?
Well, you probably have heard figures to develop a drug costs $500 million or more.
Yeah.
And especially now we're trying to do it in, you know, instead of over 5-10 years, trying to do it over 1 to 2 years.
I wanted to thank your team and you for working to double and triple shifts. I know we're everyday people here. I'm a journalist. But as a citizen, I am so encouraged by what you and your team are doing, and that you are doubling and tripling down for all of us, all 330 million Americans and more around the world that could benefit from this. I wanted to move to something you brought up, which is, you know, many of your team are Asian American, Pacific Islander, and that has certainly been in discussion as of late. Where did COVID-19 start?
Well, there's no doubt that it started in Wuhan, China. There's no doubt that it then spread from there throughout the rest of the world. We know SARS started in China, exactly where it's not certain, but the disease became apparent in southern China. We know these highly related viruses reside in bats in China. There is one bat species that carries a virus that's 97% identical to COVID-19, but undoubtedly there's one that's 99.9% identical. We just haven't found it yet. And so So this, in my mind, in the mind of the scientists, there's no question that this came from China, but it's obviously not right to call it the Chinese virus. HIV came from Africa. We don't call it the African virus. H1N1 in 2009 came from America. We didn't call it the American virus. In the past, we did that with, for example, West Nile, Sendai, and such. But we are past that, and we're better than that now. So, but I think it's also wrong to imply that this was engineered by some scientists and planted in China. I think that's all fake news. The serious scientists are asking, you know, if it came from bats, why Wuhan? And we need to think through that because Wuhan is a big city with population of about the same as New York City.
Yeah.
So why Wuhan? And that's something we haven't resolved. There are a lot of speculations because Wuhan is the place where the teams have been investigating bat viruses. And so there are lots of speculation among the scientific community whether that play any role or not.
Let's flip that on its side here, Dr. Ho. There are many Asians, Asian American, Pacific Islanders that are leading the fight against COVID-19. You have been one of those over the decades. Talk about that community of Asians and Asian American Pacific Islanders that are fighting. They're the tip of the spear in trying to find treatments and vaccines against COVID-19.
Well, I would say every scientist is highly motivated to want to contribute to this, and particularly the people who work on viruses and related topics. They all want to contribute. It's after all a pandemic that's affecting the whole world. It's turning our world upside down. Everybody wants to do something about it. We also need to keep in mind, because it started in China, a lot of the Chinese scientists pay a lot of attention and jumped in right away. And we also need to remember, even though the American science is you know, world renowned, it's the best in the world, and yet its scientists are quite international, and somewhere between 25 to 40% of our workforce in this area are scientists from China or Chinese Americans. And so there is a great deal of focus from our community on this topic because of its origin and because of its impact on the globe right now.
I want to finish now as we might go a couple minutes over here because this has been such a great conversation. I hope you don't mind, Dr. Ho. As we say, if you can stick around just a little bit longer, let's talk about the future and what we can be hopeful about. And one of the things that, you know, there's lots of stuff out there, and you're the best to really help us weed through that. Today, over the last 24 hours, as was reported by The Guardian, the UK is looking at a 15-minute home test, and they believe they can implement that in the coming weeks. What is this, and the fact or fiction on that?
These are the tests, and basically, it's a little cassette that you just need to.
Can you show it to us, Doctor? Do you have it there? Can you show it to us? Ladies and gentlemen, we did not plant this. This is actually give and take here. And of course, Dr. Ho has everything that anybody would have when it comes to COVID-19. Thanks for sharing this with us, Doctor.
So I'm cracking one open. So these tests have been around for 2 decades. For HIV testing in rural Africa, for example, it operates on the principle of trying to detect antibodies to COVID-19. And then if you see, you could put a drop of blood there.
Put a little closer if you can to the screen.
Put a little drop of blood in the well here.
Right.
And then put 2 drops of this buffer, and then wait 10 minutes up to 15 minutes. And then if you see one band at the position C, it's negative. If you see any band at position G or M, it's positive. It's 15 minutes. This is old technology. This is something that we've been testing 5 or 6 of these manufactured either in China or in Korea. I've been trying to convince the FDA to let this out. I think we've been doing the validation testing and everything so that these things could go out to the community, but we need to educate the community on how to use it, because this doesn't become positive right away in the first week of infection. In the second week of infection, it becomes very good, and after that becomes very, very good. But the typical PCR test that we now run on the swabs, it's very good early on, and then of course as the virus disappears and the test becomes negative, but that's when the antibody test becomes more positive and more informative. So these are the things that we need to get out to the world. It's inexcusable for the richest nation, strongest nation in the world that we don't have these things approved when they are in common use in China, in Korea, and in Europe.
How much do those cost? And did they use those in China and South Korea during this latest COVID-19 outbreak?
Yes, they did. And you know, the price varies from $1 to $6 depending on your volume. If you buy 1 million, it's $1.
Where are they made?
Well, this one in particular is made in Jiangsu province in China.
And so they're about 3 inches long by about 1 inch, is that right?
Yeah, that's my finger.
Wow. And so then the question is home testing safer, better overall, even if you could select from various types of testing, given it's at home, you don't have to interface with a healthcare worker?
Yes, I mean, ideally you could order these from entities like Amazon. You click on, it comes to you next day with a drop of the solution and perhaps a needle and a piece of alcohol swipe. And then you have your results. Now you need to know how to interpret it though.
Yeah.
Right?
As you were describing to us. Very quickly again, Jesse is asking which city again in China that particular test was manufactured in?
It's from the Jiangsu province.
Jiangsu, okay,
I'm
great.
not sure which city within Jiangsu.
Tech companies in Silicon Valley are putting out their own test options too. You could go on their site. They have a certain number of tests they can do per day. You sign up and you're able to get a test. Are those also good options, doctor?
Yeah, so we have to make sure we understand there are 2 types of tests. One is testing for viral RNA. That's something called PCR. And that's what hospitals and state labs have been running. And now the capacity at our hospital, for example, it's 1,000 samples a day. It used to be 20 only a few days ago. So it's ramped up quite a bit. There are also rapid tests for PCR that could be done over 45 minutes. But these tests or other antibody tests are generally done very, very quickly. So the point of care rapid diagnostic is typically 10, 15 minutes.
What do we call that? Is it an antibody test that you've been describing?
This is an antibody test, yes.
All right, as one of our participants today was asking about wide use and distribution of antibody tests. So thank you for that question to that participant. Is there any other naming around this antibody test or this specific one that's from Jiangsu?
They all have names. So far, we've been testing 4. Their performances are comparable. I don't want to get in a position of advertising for one over another. But Committee of 100 just sent me additional tests for comparison, one that I haven't, my team hasn't been looking at.
You said you're pushing the FDA. What do you need to do to be able to push them a little further if indeed this is something that could be used widely here in the United States?
Well, I think, you know, we were so short of tests. I've been saying we've been operating blind and therefore letting this epidemic explode in the US. You know, we knew it was coming. We just did it on the sideline for 6 weeks watching China struggle. That's inexcusable. And now in the name of protecting patients, you know, we're because of the shortage in testing, we're saying, oh, there's no need to test anymore. That means we're going to go totally blind. That to me is not right. We need to have clarity in order to map out our prevention strategies. I mean, you're not going to go into a war wearing blindfold. That just doesn't make any sense. You can't just say, well, we're short. If we're short, we got to make sure we're not short of these tests. And in fact, we could use every tool at our disposal, not just the PCR. That just doesn't make any sense. It makes no scientific sense. I don't know where the national leadership is.
Doctor, we're at the end of this great conversation. I wanted to ask you, what did we miss in our conversation today?
There's a lot, but I think mostly on the scientific front, and mostly on, you know, what are we going to do for the next month, 2 months, 3 months, 6 months, next year? And that's a huge question that I don't hear so much discussion about. And yet we're already, I think, well into recession, and another month or two, depression is going to follow. I mean, many of the C100 members could comment on that better than I could. But I know we need to control the epidemic, flatten the curve, avoid the surge in patients. But at what cost?
Yeah, the questions remain larger than the answers, as you've been telling us today. If you were to say the percentage of what is unknown versus known, what would that be?
Well, obviously, with the new virus, new disease, we only know a tiny fraction. But with that tiny fraction, we could still seek solutions. I don't want to be overly pessimistic. I think as a scientist working on this, I am absolutely confident we collectively will come up with an answer. And I don't mean just my lab, I mean the scientific field will come up with an answer. I'm confident of that. But the question is that a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now? I think the human tolls will be heavy if we wait too long. And so we must rush this as a top priority. And all the, you know, I hear all the $2 trillion appropriated to help. I mean, the ultimate solution is still going to be delivered through science. And you know, for too long, we have ignored or trivialized science at our own peril, and this is showing up now.
What do you tell your family when they say, Dad, do you have grandchildren, Dr. Ho?
Yes.
Grandpa, what's happening? What do you tell them?
I tell them there's a bad new virus out there. I think they understand. And a lot of people don't get all that sick from it, but some do. And that fraction is large enough to overwhelm us, because this virus will keep spreading and spreading. And looks like the hope of wiping it out is not in sight right now.
When your grandchildren are reading through the proverbial history books in their college classes or in their studies, what will be COVID-19's headline in those 10 or 20 years? You've been able to see not only AIDS and what it meant historically, as well as SARS, and others. what will be that entry into the history books that your grandchildren will read?
You know, they're going to read about the bubonic plague, the smallpox, the 1918 flu pandemic, the HIV pandemic. And right now, with the current trajectory, this will be right up there along with those other pathogens. It looks bad and we're feeling it. I'm hoping that, you know, the world would come together and galvanize and really control that. We need American leadership on the globe, and we're not seeing it. I fear that this will be one of the major pandemics in our history.
We are so glad that you are one of those leaders charging forward, though, Dr. Ho. Thank you for working to a solution for treatments for all of us collectively. Of course, all those on this gathering cannot thank you enough and your team. And we are thankful that you decided to spend precious time to speak to us, to educate us, so that we may also be part of those who may take action today. I cannot tell you enough how many thank yous are coming across in the chat right now for you. But thank you, Dr. Ho. Thank you, Committee of 100, for putting this gathering together with Dr. David Ho. I look forward to speaking with you on my network when we can, and seeing on my network as well as other networks, because your voice is so clear. So thank you all. Thank you, Dr. David Ho, for being here with us and for all your commitment to progress. Everybody else on this gathering, thank you for being here, and we will see you next time for a Committee of 100 Fireside Chat, where we get to speak with newsmakers and shakers across the country and around the world like Dr. David Ho. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you, Richard.